Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that you're all safe and healthy, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here today. You will be able to participate in a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A area in your Zoom control panel. And if you miss anything, don't worry. We'll send a link to the recorded session when it's available. Throughout the webinar, you'll see poll questions related to the webinar topic. You can respond to those polls from the device you're using to view the webinar. My name is Amy Chamberlain, and I'm an instructional designer at the CE Shop, the leading provider of online real estate education. Today, we're reviewing the property ownership topic as it relates to your licensing exam, presented by Jill Malloy. At first, we were going to look at the progress in terms of where you are in your course. Next, we will do an overview of government controls. Then we will do Q&A. So again, remember to type any questions you have into the Q&A part of Zoom. Then Jill will present additional resources for you, and then we'll conclude. Jill is a national real estate expert at the CE Shop and comes to us with many years of experience in the real estate industry, including teaching, training, and coaching thousands of students. Now, let's turn the time over to Jill.
Amy, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We are getting ready to take the first question that I'm going to ask you to answer. And this isn't a quiz, but if you would just answer it for me, it helps me to tailor this to the needs of the group. Okay. If we can wrap it up in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Well, we don't even have to wait anymore, I don't think, Donna. So it does look like the bulk of the people here have just started the course, but there's a good spread between the rest. So why don't we go ahead and get started? That tells me a little bit about what we need to cover. Those of you who feel like it's a little elementary, please understand that there are some folks who are just now starting in the course. That being said, we want to talk about this, and I wanted you to see this graph, and I know that those of you who have been with us before have seen this graph time and again, but the topic that this falls within is land use controls within your exam. So those of you who have been studying how to take the exam breaks down into these major topics, with contracts being the largest. This is actually one of the smaller of the topics, and this isn't even the full topic. It is part of land use control. So I don't want you to worry yourself too dreadfully over it, but it certainly helps to get a handle on it. So when we talk about government controls, what we're really talking about is restrictions that are placed on the rights of people who own real estate. And there's the truth of the matter. I may own it, but I don't have the right to do just any old thing I want. And that's a real discovery for some of us. When I discovered that there were really rules and I couldn't just add on to the tenant house that was on the farm, and there were things that I wasn't allowed to do. So the government controls basically fall into these 4 categories. And again, this is just a mnemonic device to help with it. PETE controls for the government what you can do with your real estate. And that's police power, the right of the government to boss people around, tell them what they can and can't do. That's eminent domain. And eminent domain is the right of the government to take private property for a bona fide public benefit, provided they're going to pay for that property. There is also the right of the government to tax the real estate, and there is the process and as cheating. So property as cheats to the government, which means that they'll actually take ownership of the property in certain situations. So let's take a look at those individually. I'm going to start with police power. Police power includes zoning, it includes building codes, it includes It includes things like what you can do in flood zones, wetlands protection, environmental hazards. Those come under this big category of police power. So I want us to look at zoning first. And when you think of zoning, I really put this here so that you could see that zoning does address the primary use that land can be given. So that's, generally speaking, that's residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural. So that's the primary use. But within that, there is further zoning. So understand that there may be aesthetic zoning, aesthetic meaning that zoning laws tell you what you can do with the exterior of your property, if it has to have a certain look to it. Now, that's not to be confused with homeowners associations telling you what color the door can be. This would be when the government is telling you. There are also density and bulk zoning, and those are very similar. Density is generally that zoning that is usually seen within residential use, and it says how many units per acre. So can you have 1 house per acre? Can you have 15 living units per acre? What is the density allowed? Whereas bulk zoning is that zoning which is also there to generally encourage or discourage the density of people, but bulk zoning has more to do with where it can be placed, where the structure can be placed on the lot, how much setback you have to have. Bulk zoning is what tells us whether or not we have to have open space or green areas left. So that has to do with bulk zoning. There is height zoning, which is often covered within bulk zoning, and in some jurisdictions is its own category. And then it really boils down to the specific use within the general use. What kind of commercial? What kind of industrial? So that has to do with getting more specific about the use of the property. So that's what zoning does, basically. Once a property is zoned, sometimes you find yourself in a position where you're having difficulty with the zoning and it's not allowing you to do what you want to do with your own property, and there may be something you can do about it. The two places that I look first would be to getting a variance or getting a conditional use or special use permit. Now, there is a difference between those two. Typically, with a variance, you're asking the zoning commission, can I do something that zoning doesn't permit? Can I just plain do something that zoning doesn't allow at all? So if you have aesthetic zoning and you feel that it is a hardship for you to make your property conform to the aesthetic zoning, you might look for a variance on that. Conditional use isn't exactly at odds with zoning. Conditional use would fall within the broad category of the zoning, but because it has some difference in it, generally, if you're going to be permitted the right to use it, conditional use or special use, you make an application for that and it's conditioned on your doing something. So I want you to think of that as a trade-off. There is one other way that we find ourselves at odds with zoning. And when we talk about this one, I want you to understand, this is because you were already using it that way. When you think of the term grandfathered, it means that you're permitted to do something because you have always done it that way. So if before the zoning happened, the property was being used in a specific way, it may be grandfathered to continue for that use. But grandpa has rules. So if you're going to be using this grandfather clause and you're going to be allowed to continue, these are the general rules. And there may be more specific rules in your jurisdiction. But generally speaking, grandpa says, okay, you can keep using it as a gas station, or you can keep using it as a general store, but you can't add on to it. You can't expand it. And if you're going to make any change to the use, that's going to be permission. And if that requires a variance because it's at odds with zoning, then even though you have a non-conforming use, now that you're asking to do something different, you may be looking for either a variance or a special use permit. And those are basically the we're not doing exactly what zoning says allowances. Are there any questions? And Amy, can you just tell me if there are any questions that have come up about that?
Yes, absolutely. So far, no questions.
Wonderful. Then I have one. If you have none, I always have a question. So here is your first question. A dentist who owns a house for residential use wants to build a dental office inside the house. The county decides to allow it if the dentist agrees to provide additional parking in the back of the house. This was accomplished through still 20 holdouts there. I really want you to take the risk of answering. No one knows what your answer is. Take the risk of answering because it really helps you learn more. Nothing helps me learn like getting it wrong the first time. All right, Donna, I don't see any budging. Why don't we go ahead and... So if you are looking at the results, you can see that most of you did say it was a special use permit. In fact, almost 2/3 of you said that, and almost 2/3 of you were absolutely correct. Here's the thing, when we say a variance, we would say it had to be at odds with zoning. But we didn't say that there would be some sort of proffer made where it was, you give me this if I allow that. It is really at odds, and we're asking them, can I do it anyway? When you're looking for a variance, typically there has to be a hardship exhibited. So the property owner who wants a variance has to demonstrate to the governing body, to the zoning commission, I have a hardship and this is going to require me to do this. A non-conforming use would have required that the dentist had been doing that all along. And so they had been permitted to do it all along. The dentist is being allowed to put the office in if they will give something up. It's conditioned on they're giving something up. So why don't we go ahead and move right along. And I'm sorry, I got right ahead of myself on that, didn't I? The special use permit, just as you said. I think I have another point to make with this, and that is, if the dentist agrees to do something, that's a condition that's being, so it's special use permit or conditional use permit. I have another question for you. Property owner wishes to expand a 2-bedroom home in a neighborhood of larger homes. The plans call for the building to exceed or go over the rear setback line established by zoning. Which is the most probable way to accomplish this? Anyone else going to be brave enough to answer? Excellent. All right, so you can see that most of us said it would require requesting a variance, And as a matter of fact, that is exactly correct. So if the property owner wants to expand, and they want to do that because they're in a neighborhood of larger homes, they feel that it can compete, that the neighborhood can withstand that, but there is zoning, there is bulk zoning that has a setback. And with that setback, they're going to have to go over it to enlarge their home. And because they're at odds with zoning, they're not being asked for anything. The fact is, they're going to request a variance. Now, if they request a variance, what have they got to be able to show? They're going to have to show a hardship. So it's going to exceed the rear setback, but if they're going to do this, they're going to have to demonstrate that there's a hardship. I think we've got another question for you. Which of the following is least likely to be regulated by zoning ordinance? Okay, there you go. You can see that most of you said the size of the entrances to the building would be least likely to be guided by zoning. And as a matter of fact, most of you were exactly correct on that. So if it's not regulated by zoning, what's the difference here? What is it regulated by? Well, here's the difference. You have zoning and you have building codes. Typically, generally, usually, normally, zoning in some way applies to the land, to the use of the land, to the relationship, to the surroundings, or even to the parking needs. That's generally going to be zoning. Building codes generally have to do with the structure. Now, you did have an answer in there that I think really could have thrown you off, and that was the exterior of the building. But since there is sometimes aesthetic zoning that is about how it looks on the exterior, how does the entire area look on the exterior, that which is least likely to be zoning is going to be that which has to do with safety and or compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that's the size of the doors. How big do they have to be? All right, so now there's another question for you. Which of the following is likely to be discovered as a result of the occupancy permit process? You don't have to be sure to take a guess. When you're taking the real test, you're going to take a guess, because no answer is always wrong, and some answer has a chance of being correct. There we go. Excellent. So the answer that I see being overwhelming here, actually, again, with not quite 2/3, but almost 2/3, is that this would be a building code violation that would be discovered as a result of this, rather than a zoning violation or HOA or deed restriction. And the correct answer is that it would indeed be a building code violation. But why is that? How do I know that that's a building code violation? Well, here's the issue. Who's going to issue permits? Who's going to issue those building permits? And it's not the zoning commission who's going to issue them. Those are issued when you're actually doing the building or the improvement. You have a contractor putting on a deck. They probably pulled a permit. If they didn't, they asked you to pull one as the homeowner. So in fact, that's a building code violation. That being said, I wonder, how does a zoning violation get discovered? Well, sometimes it's not discovered until a survey is done. Often it's discovered because some neighbor is watching and they wonder if in fact what's being added on is allowed, but it's not through pulling those permits for the building that the zoning violation is going to be discovered. Any questions at all? Anything, Amy?
No, it looks like we don't have questions yet.
Then we're brilliant. We don't need them because I have plenty. And now we're going to talk a little bit about still within police power, still the government telling you what you can and can't do with your privately owned property, comes what you can do in floodplain. What about wetlands and shoreline? What about those? And here are ways that the government will control that land. One way is simply by taking ownership of it. But more likely, they will have building restrictions, and that may come in the form of zoning. So they have building restrictions that are a result of zoning, or they have conservation easements. There is also national flood insurance, which we're going to look at in just a moment. This is something that real estate licensees really need to be aware of, even if you are not the expert that in the end people will get the final advice from, but we need to at least be aware of it. So, national flood insurance. All I want to know what is the primary purpose of it? What does it exist for? Is that as many of you as want to answer? No, a couple more. Wonderful. So, by the way, once again, it's really excellent to see that you've got a really good handle on this. 2/3 of you said that it was to provide less expensive flood insurance in communities that do cooperate with the National Flood Insurance Program. And 2/3 of you are correct about that. That's exactly what it's there for. And I just want to address that just a little bit more before we move away from it. And that is to say this: the National Flood Insurance Program exists because insurance companies were walking away from communities that were in high-risk areas. And so they came in to subsidize initially. They came in initially to subsidize. But as we dealt with weather changes, what they discovered was this, that in fact there was more and more flooding. And so the National Flood Insurance Program stepped in so that insurance companies would not leave altogether to take care of subsidizing insurance. A community, especially high-risk communities, could choose to cooperate in the program or not to cooperate. If they don't choose to cooperate, it doesn't mean that there's definitely not insurance available, but it probably won't be at the right price. So the fact is that those communities that did cooperate are able to get insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, the FEMA maps are the maps, and if you ever go there, it's kind of fun. As a real estate licensee, you will never go there for your client. You will send them there on their own. But the FEMA maps are only about 60% correct as it is. It would be nice if they ever get updated. And part of what the National Flood Insurance Program would like to see is updated FEMA maps. But the truth of the matter is that's not the primary purpose. It existed in order to bring down the cost of flood insurance for communities that would cooperate. Let's move ahead. And I think that's probably all you're going to need to know about that. Wetland regulation. It's least likely to include which of those? Discharge or dredge? Discharge of dredge or fill. And by the way, dredge, that's simply the fill that comes out of the wetland itself. So dredging the wetland itself. Structures that may be built. Protection of wildlife. Which one is it not likely to cover? Those of you who have ever had property that included wetlands probably are very familiar with this. And you know what was permitted and what you had to get permission for. Oh, can't we edge it up to 70%? There we go. We edged it up. Thank you. So the one that it's least likely to include is the style of the building facades. So, and when we think about that, let's just look at what they're trying to accomplish. With the wetlands, they are trying to protect the wetland areas. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't discharge dredge, which is from the wetlands themselves, the land that comes up, that you can't discharge fill into the wetlands. It's not that you can't do it. In fact, there are some places where actually in wetlands they have created gardens, they have created buildable areas. But in order to do that, you have to get a permit. You have to get a permit for discharge of dredge or fill, and it won't be granted in every case. Certainly, it's going to regulate the kind of structure, and that's right down to regulating whether or not you can put a dock in. You know, we talk about the riparian right to put a dock in. Well, yeah, kind of, sort of, if you're in a riparian right state. But the fact is, you may have that riparian right unless it's at odds with the regulations that don't permit you to put a dock in. The wetland regulation exists to protect the wetlands in part because there's wildlife that only exists there. What they don't care about is the facade of your building if you're going to build one, if you are permitted to build it. So that's the part that they don't care about. What I do want you to know is this. I want you to know Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Just kind of put that up in your head. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act requires permitting for release of dredge or fill into wetlands, into U.S. waters at all. All right. Another question for you. Which best describes the relationship between conservation easements and wetlands? And for those of you who have studied easements, you know that an easement is your right to use someone else's property. Which best describes the relationship between conservation easements and the wetlands themselves? Dave, we'll get to you in just a couple of minutes if you'll type that question into the chat. I'll take a pause after this question is answered. Donna, I don't see it moving any higher. Excellent. All right, so easements are not necessarily in perpetuity, meaning they go on forever. So I do want you to understand that. And conservation easements are often with time limitations. All right, so certainly, although that looks like it could be a good answer, it's not what we're looking for. The correct answer here is that conservation easements allow landowners to benefit financially for protecting wetlands. And let me see if I can explain this for you. Fee simple ownership is when I have the full bundle of rights to the property. That's what we think of as I own it. And you may have an easement across the right to use my land. So a conservation easement is just an easement. That means that the government doesn't have fee simple ownership. The conservation easement could be granted to the government, and it could be granted to a private organization that looks to protect wetlands. But what happens is they pay you for this right. So if you own the land, they pay you to not build on it. They pay you to leave it natural. Conservation easement. So you get paid to not use your land, which is kind of interesting. It is a way to protect the wetlands while the owner financially benefits. And Amy, I think we might have a question at this point.
Let's look and see. I'm still not seeing one. Did you see one pop up, Jill?
I didn't see a question. I saw a hand go up.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, participants, we can't help you when you do that. What we'll need you to do is type your question to the Q&A, and then we can help you from there.
Thanks, Amy. All right, here we go. Now we're going to talk a little bit about, and we're still in police power. We haven't gotten anywhere else. We're still in police power. Controls over environmental issues. And when we talk about environmental issues, it is possible that you could be asked a little bit about the environmental issue itself. So I just wanted you to see this graphic for just a moment because these are the biggest issues that we may get asked about. Starting over on the left, asbestos, which can be found in insulation, it can be found in flooring, it can be found in ceilings. Asbestos. Asbestos generally is not a problem till it starts to break apart and the friable particles get in the air and you breathe them in. And that's what you need to know about it. It can cause mesothelioma, it can cause cancer, it can cause other breathing problems. Lead. Lead was used in paints. Also, sometimes you will find groundwater contamination, lead groundwater contamination because of lead pipes. So lead is something that is especially dangerous for young children. Typically, we're talking 6 and under, and it can cause mental retardation. Radon is an odorless, and this you should know just in case, odorless, colorless. So if someone says that you're going to know about radon because you smell it, that's not happening. You don't see it, you don't smell it. The only way you'll find it is testing for it. And it is a carcinogen. Mold. Mold is worse on some people than it is on others. It can be a health hazard. Unfortunately, it's not always visible like that mold is. This won't be a national exam question, but you do want to know for your state examination how your state treats mold, especially with respect to tenants who discover mold in a house that they have leased, and what are the landlord's obligations at that point. And no, I'm not covering that in this because there are too many states here, but that's something that I do want you to be aware of. I said that you could see groundwater contamination from lead. You can also see groundwater contamination from things like underground storage tanks that used to hold oil. And so groundwater contamination then contaminates the water that we are drinking and washing with. A brownfield is when the ground has become so contaminated that it needs to be repaired before you can go ahead and use it. And there are some benefits that are given to people oftentimes who will repair brownfields. What is the relationship between the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which you probably know as CERCLA, and the Brownfields Law, which you probably know as the Brownfields Law? Even if you've never heard of a CERCLA, thank you, it's worth a guess, because a guess that's right gives you a point. A guess that's wrong doesn't, but no answer doesn't give you a point either. It's no worse than a guess that's wrong. And part of what I want you to do is I want you to get over being worried about being precisely right. When you're taking the real exam, you mark that question and you march on. At the end, if you have time, you'll go back to it, and if something has lit up your mind, give you 5 more seconds if you want to answer. And I think our 5, thank you. So I'm really happy to see this because almost half of you did get this one correct. And I want to address this just briefly with you. It's not something you have to know a lot about, but CERCLA came into being in order to make sure that contaminated land would be cleaned up and that they'd like to hold the person responsible who did it. But in CERCLA, what was interesting was they said, if you bought contaminated land, and you owned it, you could potentially be held liable for the cleanup even if you didn't contribute, even if you didn't contribute to the contamination. So later, I think it was 2002, the Brownfields Law. The Brownfields Law was adopted, and the Brownfields Law gives innocent owners who did not contribute a way to avoid liability. And that's what that was all about. And you don't need to know a whole lot about it, but I will tell you, in 2002, when the Brownfields Law was adopted, it did not replace CERCLA. All it did was it added a layer giving innocent owners a way to avoid liability and the financial responsibility to clean up land that they had done nothing to. Well, gave that debt away, didn't I? If there's asbestos insulation around pipes and it shows signs of damage, and remember I said with asbestos, it's when the particles break up that they're dangerous. What is the best choice to take care of it? Excellent. So it looks like almost half the group said to have it encapsulated. An equal number, almost, of you said to either report it to the EPA or have it removed. And either way, you would have it done by professionals. You wouldn't do it yourself because you start to mess with that stuff. And of course, you're breaking it up and the friable particles get into the air. So one choice, and 9% of you said this, 3 people said just leave it alone. And you'd think that that would be the correct answer. And although it's a very good answer, it's not the correct answer because invariably it will begin to break up and it's already started to. It already shows signs of damage. So what you want to do, the best choice is to have it encapsulated. Now that just means sealed off, and the professionals seal it off first and then they wrap it typically. When it is encapsulated, then the friable particles don't get out. The problem with having it removed, even professionally, is this, that friable particles may get loose in the air and could cause a problem. And there is no need to report it to the EPA. They're not going to come and fix it for you. You need to call an EPA approved cleanup person for that. All right. Another question for you. Primary purpose, uh-oh, this is not sounding like police power to me. Looks like we might be done with that. What's the primary purpose of condemnation hearing? Which, by the way, has to do with the state's right of eminent domain. I think that's it, Donna. Excellent. So it looks like we're about equally split between closing a building because of building code violations, which is what I always thought before I got into real estate, or to decide if the desired use is for bona fide public benefit. And that brings us to what we're actually talking about here. By the way, that is the answer, to decide if the desired use is of a public benefit. because condemnation here doesn't have to do with what we used to think of, oh, that building's so bad it ought to be condemned. It's just dangerous. That's not what it has to do with. It doesn't have to do with determining habitability. Condemnation is when the government or some other entity for bona fide public benefit needs your land. They want your land for bona fide public benefit. And whether that benefit is to widen streets, build a school, or in some cases, even sports arenas have been allowed this benefit. There are rules, there are rules to how they can condemn it. So here's what I want you to know about condemnation hearings. They have to do with the government's right of eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right of the government to take private property for a public benefit, provided just compensation is paid. The primary purpose of the condemnation hearing is to decide, is this a big enough public benefit? Is it a big enough public benefit to be able to take the land and just pay the people what it's worth? As a smaller part of it, if a price has not been agreed upon, certainly that price can be part of what's determined. Ooh, I don't like that thing there yet. I apologize. So eminent domain, the right of the government to take private property for public use, provided just compensation is paid. The process of the taking is called condemnation. And when you go to a condemnation hearing, it's about, is the good of the many more important than the good of the one? How heavy is that weight? So that is what that's about. And this was one more police power that somehow got out of order. Which of the following is not required by federal law? Having to do with environmental issues. Which of the following is not, all in capitals, required by federal law? Okay, thank you, Donna. At some point in your course, I want you to take a look at the federal lead-based paint disclosure that's required. And I really want you to pay attention to it because this does give us some really good information. First, I want to say that it's one of the few disclosures that a seller makes to a buyer that must also be acknowledged by the licensee involved in the transaction. So even a licensee, that's how serious they are about this. They want the licensee to acknowledge it. And the licensee isn't saying whether or not there's lead, they're just acknowledging that this has been delivered. Buyers of residential real estate built before 1978 are given a 10-day period for a risk assessment of lead-based paint hazards. They may waive that, and in many markets, especially when it's a very hot or seller's market, they do waive it. But they are, by law, allowed that 10 days unless they waive it. The sellers of homes that were built prior to 78 must give the buyers a copy of the EPA pamphlet explaining the hazards of lead paint. And the fact is the buyers acknowledge having received that on that lead-based paint disclosure. The lead-based paint disclosure form is acknowledged by all three, so the only one that is not true is that the seller must mitigate. They don't have to mitigate anything. They don't have to mitigate one little bit. The buyer simply has the right to know. Good, here we go. We're going for some more eminent domain now. County offers to purchase private owner's property in order to build a much needed highway bypass. Which of the following statements is true? All right. And I will say this immediately. 54% of you are absolutely correct. Are absolutely correct. You can counter the offer. Condemnation requires just compensation. It's not going to happen without compensation. Condemnation proceeding is not necessarily likely to result in a higher price. Didn't say it wouldn't. And the owner doesn't have to accept anything. They can force a condemnation hearing. Then we're going to talk about taxation. So now we've looked at police power, which is the big category, eminent domain, and now taxation in Pete. Taxation, two things I want you to know about it. Ad valorem taxes are taxes based on the value of the real estate. That's what ad valorem taxes are. The assessed value times the tax rate equals the taxes. Special assessment taxes only are paid by the properties that benefit. Therefore, putting some basic improvement in, like street lights or like sidewalks, that only benefit specific properties. So they're not paid by the entire jurisdiction that's being taxed. And special assessment taxes, usually they take the cost of whatever they put in the improvement and they allow it to be paid over years. And then I want to tell you this, mark your calendar for December 17th unless you're going to be past the exam by then. Because on December 17th, we'll go over the actual calculations that are involved in the proration of taxes and how they're calculated. And then I have another question for you that might have to do with escheat, a co-owner in joint tenancy, dies intestate. What is the most likely disposition of her real estate? Joint tenant. This is a complicated question because it really deals with more than one sort of issue, as easy as it seems to be. Because what you have to know about in answering this is not only about escheat, but really you need to know about this, what a joint tenant does. So When you have joint tenants, if one joint tenant dies, the other joint tenants, called survivors, get to keep the joint. They get to keep the rest. So that's how joint tenancy works. Joint tenancy, or I'm sorry, stumbling over my tongue, or survivorship, joint tenancy, rights of survivorship takes precedence. That's an operation of law. It takes, if I've got a joint tenant, I can't will my interest to someone else. They're my joint tenant and they'll get it by operation of law. If I have a will, it won't escheat to the state. So if I'm a joint tenant, it won't escheat to the state. If I have a will, it won't escheat to the state. If I don't have a will, but they can find heirs under the laws of descent and distribution, in that case, it won't go to the state. But if the property, if I die and there is no operation of law as a result of survivorship, there is no will, and no heirs can be found, that's when it escheats to the state. That's when it would escheat to the state. So, escheat, no will, no heirs, and there's a state-specific time frame for that escheat to occur, that they have to look for the heirs. And here's what I would like you to remember about escheat. You have been escheated out of your real estate, but you don't care. You're not upset because you're dead. That's escheat. So, just very quickly, what do you expect on the exam? Some of you already know this. There may be 5 to 10 experimental questions. That is, they're being beta tested. They don't count in your grade. You are not, when that question comes up, the timer stops running. You won't notice it, but you're not charged time for it. So please, if you're supposed to have 40 questions and what you see is 45, you're not having to answer more. You shouldn't be upset. You're not having to answer more in less time. What to expect about your specific state? Check your state's candidate guide. In our course, you'll find the candidate guide link in the course, or you can go to the testing site, that's Pearson VUE, PSI, or AMP. You can go there and get the candidate guide. That'll tell you how many questions to expect, what the passing score is for your state, and it'll also tell you what kind of questions to expect. So Amy, any questions?
Yes, let's have a look and see what we've got here. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for what you've done, what you've talked about today, Jill. We will take some time for some questions. Please, if you have any, type them into the Q&A in your control panel, because if you have a question, most likely someone else has the same question or could learn from you. Maybe if you ask a question, someone else might say, I never even thought of that. That was something I wouldn't have even thought to ask. So we would really appreciate that if you would share.
And if there are none, Amy, I'm not worried about it. Oh, I'm sorry.
What do you mean?
I said, if there are no questions, I'm okay with that.
There are no questions. It must mean that you've covered everything so thoroughly. But we have a, here we go, it's a question. Was there a specific part of the wetlands law that you mentioned we should remember? The text was
yes, and it's the Clean Water Act. It's actually, it's a law that applies to wetlands. It's section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And I just want you to know that that's the one that says if you're going to do, have dredge or fill discharged into U.S. waters, you need a permit.
Good, thank you. We have another one here. If you die intestate, are there no probate options?
Thank you so much. Well, you know, what I will say is I don't want to address whether or not I will say there is no probate if it's a joint tenancy. That I can tell you. So joint tenancy won't be probated. And that's what I base that on, that question. I don't know if there's no will, if there's ever a probate. I'd have to look that up. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we have covered all of the questions. And at this point, Jill, is there anything else you want to cover before we wrap up?
Heavens no, I think I owe these people an extra minute off.
Thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate you being here. I'd like
Good
to
luck
thank
on your exams.
Yeah, yes, that's always good to say, right? And thanks to Jill for joining us today. Your knowledge and expertise and willingness to share it with our students is greatly appreciated. Look out for an email from us. It will have a link to today's recorded session, and keep an eye out for invitations to additional webinars in the near future. When this webinar ends, we would invite you to complete a survey. If you could take a minute, we would really love your feedback so that we can continue to provide valuable webinars for you. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Amy.